For those of you who don't know, January is Family Literacy Month. This talk is an urgent invitation to see literacy not only as a practice of self-expression, but as a radical anti-racist act capable of transforming how we learn, teach, and dream collectively. Thank you for joining this morning. I am Regan. I am now the MAR Talks and the MAR Shift Coordinators. MAR is deeply honored to welcome Cecily Nicholson, acclaimed author, poet, and educator, for a powerful conversation on the radical potential of literacy. Cecily brings insights from her work as a writer, educator, organizer, and community advocate, inviting us to reflect on how reading, writing, and storytelling have long served as anti-racist practices. So welcome, Cecily. We are so grateful to have you today. And to start off, I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do.
Reagan, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Let me just share that I'm joining you from the occupied territory of the Kwantlen. Catesy, Musqueam, it's an interesting confluence of waterways and land here, colonially known as New Westminster. From my window, I have a view of the river known by many as the Stolo, which is a constant source of inspiration to me. I'm delighted to be here. So thank you so much for the invitation and for the work of Moms Against Racism. I love you. Where were you when I was a kid? No, it's okay. It's good. So briefly, myself, currently I'm a professor, an assistant professor in the School of Creative Writing at UBC. And I teach mainly in poetry and creative forms. I'm really interested in sound. I do a lot of work at intersections of research and arts. And that's sort of where I've been working the last 5 or so years. However, I have a long history as an administrator and as an educator, and I'm trained and worked initially for many years in the realm of social services. So that's kind of how I came up. And in the last 15 years, my work in education and administration has spanned artist-run culture, community-based art practices, my own volunteer and collaborations with community, as well as interpretive programs and public programs at the realm of the municipal gallery. So I coordinated school programs for SD36, shout out Surrey, and as part of for working for the city of Surrey and the Surrey Art Gallery. So that I really learned a lot in all of those contexts about, I believe in art, I believe in all of these sort of joyful practices, but the barriers, many of them are surmountable because they're not necessarily about material, not necessarily about cost. So really trying to bridge that kind of work has been a really joyful sort of turn in my practice. So yeah, but these days, yes, I guess mainly a teacher and a volunteer.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And so just framing our conversation, I would love to turn to literacy. And I wanted to ask you, what does the love of words mean to you? And how does literacy connect to who we are and essentially how we move through the world?
Well, thank you for this opening question. The love of words means to me, I love words, and I always have. And I am super grateful for the role of language and reading in particular for myself growing up as a child. And so I grew up, I'm mixed race, but I identify as a Black femme. I grew up in rural southwestern Ontario. If you know the area, you may know it's not a particularly diverse place. Growing up, my racialized and queer siblings, that we really struggled. The dominant cultures around us were Mennonite, Dutch, English, and my education for my first 13 years was at a farm school. So in my first year of high school, so it was like literally a bus from a farm to a farm school. So you can imagine I just had a really narrow and non-urban experience. Reading and language was an incredible gateway for me to stories of adventure and imagination and places around the world, regardless of racialization. And certainly was my initial and early connections to Black diasporic culture in particular, as well as Indigenous authors and writing, though that came a little later, probably in my teens. I think that work found me in part because of excellent educators, beautiful people that realized that I love to read. And so I'm really grateful for that. But as a young kid, I actually didn't speak hardly at all. I had a lot of challenges in terms of what I had survived as a kid in a former ward of the state. I'd grown up and had experienced foster homes at a young age and was adopted. It was a challenging environment. And so I didn't speak a lot. And I think, but I was quite a listener. But there was a point in time where I learned how to read. I learned how to read quite young. I was so grateful for it because it just opened up this kind of a portal, really, in terms of other ways of thinking and being. And that was about knowledge, and that was about culture and connection, but it was also about mental health. And to this day, a love of words is something that always it lends a possibility of being carried away, on other people's words and craft. And then, of course, eventually realizing that I could do the same thing. My younger brother and I, growing up, we didn't know what poetry really was. Nobody really taught us poetry. Maybe we learned Flanders Field or something around Remembrance Day and such. But what we did have access to was music and lyric. And so we understood crafting songs as an element of creative out. So my early poems were all song lyrics. And that gift of writing just ballooned and grew. I had no idea it would ever be something that would impact my career, as it were. Never thought of it that way. But yeah, a massive shift for me in terms of cognition, connection, and awareness. And I think depending on our relationships to language and words, and it doesn't have to be so deep and devoted. I was pretty nerdy about books, but everything from comics to graphic work to listening and hearing lyrical work, just a wonderful connection and escape.
Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciated what you said about lyrics and music. That was something I really hadn't thought about when I think of literacy and words. My automatic thought goes to books and poems. And so, yeah, totally music and lyrics and how that, literacy connects us to people really well and their experiences. And so it's really interesting hearing how you connect with it and how it shaped how you walk through the world and what literacy has meant to you. People experience literacy in different ways depending on their families and their cultures and their communities. Your work in particular really illuminates that. And like you said, your upbringing and how that influenced what literacy was for you. And if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit more about it, but how have your experiences as a racialized woman shaped how you read and write and tell stories? How have you brought yourself into that?
There was a very distinct moment as I was leaving home as a teenager. So I left home 16, 17 and as an emancipated youth, and soon after headed to Toronto on a Greyhound bus. And I have a distinct memory that I've shared publicly about reading Dionne Brand's work and Toni Morrison's work, both of whom, if you haven't had a chance to come across their writing, are just extraordinary writers in terms of their craft, just, globally have had such an impact in literary culture. But reading them and a big part of what I was reading for was not just sort of a connection to Black culture and this imagined Caribbean connection, which I never, had never been able to realize, but was also to an African American culture, sorry, I should add, but was also to the idea of the city. And it helped excite me about the city, humanize sort of the pressures and the everydayness, the idea of being a laborer, connecting to people outside of the home and forging new family, all of that. So it really sparked my imagination, helped ground me as I headed off and started off in university quite young. It was a very challenging experience, as you can imagine. Coming from the rural as a very slow-moving person talker, coming to the university spaces, and it really got the better of me, really struggled with addiction and consciousness experience all the way through that. Writing, reading never left me, and my desire to connect to people through language, the capacities that I had as a speaker and as a writer, I quickly learned was an actual power. It was actually not just fulfilling a mental health or cognitive kind of need to connect. It was actually a skill set and a very powerful one at that. So the ability to work through language. And that was a big part of how I managed to get help, to build and form new relationships that were beautiful and strong and healthy and safe, and really help write myself in terms of this idea of education. And got me excited about school in a way that was, the more it expanded, the more I realized that school was not this oppressive place where a lot of terrible things often happened, frankly, in terms of power dynamics and support or lack thereof. So just it opened in a way, it was expansive in terms of consciousness. And so that kind of worked. But I also think for people who, have the superpower perhaps of growing up with multiple languages in their home, and growing up in diaspora, which can be a very challenging thing, as you know, like that kind of sense of displacement and dispossession through time and incredible distance. But growing those relations back through the literary, a range of language use has also been quite something that I've witnessed and mentored and just admired general field. the more I engaged with writing, the more I engaged in sort of admitting that I was a writer, my community grew. Yeah, I don't know if that's answering the question quite, but
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Which was actually my next question, but you touched on it a bit, was that literacy, like reading, writing, storytelling has always held tremendous power for BIPOC communities and people, and, has been a way to survive what you just touched on, but has been an outlet for so many BIPOC people. And kind of just bring it all together, what you just said, but why do you think that literacy is such a powerful tool for injustice, for healing, for BIPOC communities?
I think there's a lot of different ways to look at how this can work. Some of the things I would point to, we talked already a little bit about the external stuff. So the capacity to articulate, to feel strong and comfortable in our own words and our own experiences, to connect with others who may have similar experiences, whether it's about culture or class or origin and so on. But also the internalized stuff. So when I think about resistance, like, maybe in the school with Frantz Fanon, but I mean, we can look at power structures, and absolutely that's an everyday thing that we must do. But it is so critical and important to galvanize ourselves internally. And internalized racism is really the most insidious. It's the most damaging. It's not just something that impacts terribly our own personal self-worth and sense of self, but it also impacts us at the level of community. So that idea of lateral racism or violence that perhaps we've had experiences with. And so when we can really heal and feel a kind of strength and power, and I don't mean a malicious power, obviously, just like a beautiful sort of sense of being within ourselves, our capacity to participate well in the world around us, I think, expands. And I think storytelling in and of itself, it is interesting because a lot of time racialized authors or authors from marginalized experiences onto a status quo are often constructed as political. I often get described as an activist, which is an uncomfortable term for me. After all these years, I find myself in service to community and alongside the people that I love, passionately feel, want to support. But that's a way of life, and I think others have said it better. I think of Leanne Simpson's comment on it, and others who just powerhouses in the world. But it's a way of being. And one of the ways in which, from whatever marginalized perspective and position, especially a racialized one, that we experience, that outsiderness, telling our stories, it's not necessarily a political thing. It's just simply telling our stories. However, the impact, how that potentially disrupts the status quo and interrupts power, absolutely can function at the level of the political. And one of the most powerful ways that happens is by garnering empathy. And so I think about connection. I think it's the most important. I think when I write, my number one back in my mind audience is always community, in part because I think that's the most constructive audience for my work. But I'm also always thinking about structures of power, what I'd like to reveal and what I'd like to interrupt. And a way in which we can do that is not necessarily by the didactic or by the really direct, protest statement. And again, there's always room for that as well. But oftentimes it is about the storytelling and sharing just the observation and the factual experience of everyday lives. And for some poets and authors and writers in the world, simply writing that story, expressing that story. And so just remembering that literacy, we think about the print culture, but there's so much in the broad history, the art history, and contemporary culture that is the orality of it as well. And so telling our story, constructing it, actually understanding and thinking it through, these could be incredibly moving moments that can inspire empathy across great differences.
Thank you for sharing that. I actually had a little bit of a sub-question pop up there when you were chatting, and you were talking about the term activist and how I believe you said it makes you a little bit uncomfortable. I was just wondering if you could touch on that a bit and maybe how that shaped how you approach your work.
Sure. I think it's just what happens with that word, and it's similar to the idea of political. It's one of the ways in which a perspective can be sort of instrumentalized and sort of moved outside as an exception. And it has a lot of stigma attached to it. It's sort of one of those things that it's not a word that is necessarily, depends on your perspective, but a lot of people are uncomfortable with the idea. Even if it's like, in my mind, maybe a progressive liberal perspective, activists are still like, they're there to disrupt. They're not, there's something pointed about it. But so many people that I observed through the years who are engaged in the work every day of addressing systemic power and injustice, they're just living their lives in assertive and caring and deliberate ways. So connecting with community, that's not activist work. Feeding family or a gathering of people and spending a day in the kitchen. This is not, but it's also just the work that we have to do to make things accessible and to be present. We need to roll up with care, with food and warmth and structure. And so that I feel like sometimes the ways in which we construct activists is this exceptional thing, whereas where real change happens is in all of these places. It is in the classroom, it is in the kitchen, it is on the street, it is quietly in conversation individually with people that maybe disagree with us.
I really appreciate that perspective because I think it's interesting as a BIPOC to call yourself an activist when a lot of these acts are just a part of daily existence and what it is to be accountable to relationship to other people, to community. So I appreciate you sharing that and expanding on that a bit.
Just briefly, I realized it's also about what is a sustainable practice of social change. So is it the thing where we burn ourselves out and a really intensive focus on something, or is it something that we fold into our everyday life in a measured and healthy way with consistency, community, and care all the time? That's the difference between, I've been involved in organizing and activist work, and, that family that I grew up with, for all our aches and pains, we were environmentalists. We fought, things like the draining of habitat, the cutting down of trees. We saved our money and sent to try to save the whales. Like we had this kind of, from since I was a kid. And then I got involved in Days of Action and union organizing as a teenager, and so on and so on. I've always been involved in campaigns and groups and organizations. And I'm convinced that the only way that I'm still doing this work, and hopefully, with luck, until the day I leave this planet, is because I'm taking time with it. It is a slow project, and it is not an individual one.
Circling back to what you had said earlier, what you were saying that literacy has been such a powerful form of resistance. And so how do you see reading, writing, and storytelling helping people heal or create change?
Some of the things I've talked about in terms of seeing ourselves in our stories, connecting to others with their stories, striving to write a sense of self, build empathy with others. These things are all potentially happening with literacy. It's an incredible skill set, and the age of AI is no different, to be able to express yourself. And in fact, it's perhaps one of the hardest things that we do, especially when what we're expressing is really difficult. And so when we've survived things or we're surviving things, the capacity to have a break from that cognitively, to be able to express into a format or a forum, and I think art generally is very helpful, not just the writing, the literacy, but being able to express into a format. There's a process that's happening there that's actually processing what you've experienced, giving you perspective on it, and putting it somewhere else. So letting it out, it's not all contained in here. And potentially when we do that in a public-facing way, even if it's just a classroom-facing way, I can remember the first time I read a poem in front of a class. Terrifying. But I was sharing a story, and 25 people in that setting or whatever it was heard that story. And potentially that changed how they related to me. And sometimes, and this happens all the time with writing poetry is the realm of very condensed expression. Often somebody in that room, maybe more than one person in that room, relates or is reminded of something that helps them lift up or amplify something they're feeling. And then they'll come talk to you, sometimes they don't, but you might hear about it later. I used to write a lot of notes after the fact to people because I was super shy back in the day. But those connections are golden. So it's not just about ourselves or our families. It's also thinking about, you don't even know the stranger that's going to be potentially impacted by the work that you do. And what a gift if we're so lucky to do that. So I think about it that way. And then I think also, like the stories that, kitten on the table, the stories that, that aren't told, maybe our family experience, maybe our individual experience, maybe our childlike perspective is not understood. Maybe there's something very special, and in fact, probably is something very special about anybody's voice. So there's always something that we can contribute. But also, simply stories and language, and it can be really fun. And it's the basis of all our media, whether it's video games or movies or whatever. That's all writers, and it's quite a high level of craft. I think about humor. Humor is just one of the highest forms of intelligence. It is an incredibly challenging skill to come by. If you are funny in your writing in real life, there's something going on there that's special. And so all of that kind of work, it isn't just the dark and the dreary. We're lifting ourselves up with joy and adventure, and the realm of children's lit is spectacular these days. Like, it's extraordinary. I can't believe some of the things. I read a lot in it. My partner is my husband is a teacher, works with children ages 5 to grade 12, so quite a range in the realm of speech and language training. So we read a lot of children's lit, and it's just at an incredible state these days. And then in the realm of poetry and picture books and all of that, I can't get over it. I enjoy it so much. I think of I don't know if you know Jordan Scott's work, who lives on the island actually, and it has a beautiful book, Talk Like a River. It's just gorgeous. Explores the impact of growing up with a stutter, but in comparison to the river. And there's so many examples, but that one just comes to mind because it's doing so much around building understanding and capacity in the classroom for a child who might experience that, but also just it's done beautifully. It also connects to the river and ecosystems. And I mean, just this kind of work is it's a joy to behold. And meanwhile, it's doing all of this incredibly important change making. So yeah, I think there's so much to be said about it. Yeah, off the top of myself.
Your love of words is really shining through. There's a few things in that stood out to me when you're talking about how not only when you're the one writing, but when someone else is reading your writing, you don't know how it might impact them or change their life in some way. And I think of all the amazing books that I've read or poems that I've read where it's like someone is sharing their truth, but they would never know how much of an impact that piece of writing or that statement or sentence has had in my life.
Yeah.
And, a part of me that has been healed because of reading that or thinking of something in a way. And so it really, really isn't just so powerful, but it's healing and it's thinking about things in a new way. And so even children's book, like our amazing book basket, shout out to everyone that does that, but like has such tremendous power to be able to change something for someone else, not just as a writer, but when you're reading it. And I collect children's books. I love children's books because the way that, even as an adult, the way that they're able to connect with you and the things that you're able to grasp and understand. And I just think you put it so beautifully. So
That's so cool. So you collect children's books. Right on. Yeah.
Yeah. I think they're able to convey such beautiful messages in a really simple way without the complexities and overthinking it. And I think I love the pictures on them too. So yeah.
But that's also potentially how you learn to write them.
Yeah.
And collaborate on them because they're almost always a collaboration. And but yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah, and I think that's also, when you think of children's book, we associate them really quickly with children. But I think they can be such a great resource for adults and for those who just sometimes need just through a simpler lens, through something that's more accessible for people,
Well, it makes me think of, like, I remember leaving my doctoral studies years ago and not being well about reading and actually being quite alienated and cognitively probably somewhat disabled at the time for a bunch of reasons. And I think about the first thing that got me back reading. I was stayed up. I retreated to a friend's up in Whitehorse and just needed some quiet time. And she happened to have on her shelf all the Harry Potter books. Now I have grave difference with the author and the anti-trans. And this is brutal. It's so sad. What a loss. But at the time, opened those books up. And so there's something about, like, just sometimes, it's not about it being, Dostoevsky or like, we don't need necessarily to read Shakespeare, although we should read all of the above if we can and we want to. But sometimes it is just simply reading.
We're on the subject of amazing books and children's books. Thinking about the next generation as a poet and educator, how do you introduce young people, particularly racialized children, to the power of words? And how do you make reading and writing feel more accessible and exciting? How do you address topics when they might feel challenging for kids, but are important to address, but, can be really complex?
All those questions are really hard ones. I just want to acknowledge, and I think that there's whole educations and careers that are devoted to thinking through those practices. And so my experience in education, I have worked with preschool or young children, but that's been fairly rare. I mainly work with high school age and university students and general community. So I just want to foreground that in the limits of my experience in education and knowledge on the topic with respect. But I'm a very devout auntie, and a lot of kids in my purview who struggle, who have survived things themselves and are working through cognitive kinds of barriers and dissonance and all the spiciness that is fairly common increasingly today. So I do have a lot of just personal experience with that. I think that any kind of education, the best kind, is a kind of inquiry-based practice. So the sense that we're not telling, it's not it's not an instructive thing. It's not us sort of leading the path. It's looking to that subject, the child, the student, to indicate their interests and to follow those with them. So if they're interested in bugs, okay, there is so much to read about bugs, and maybe it's not maybe it's books, maybe it's picture books, maybe it's something in the form of a book. But maybe it's let's go to the nature center, or go for a walk and pop into such and such a place. And we're reading maybe the didactics. Maybe we're looking at a massive picture of a beetle and we're like, what's its name? Where did it come from? So introducing language in all the ways in which it occurs outside of book form and inside it, of course, is one of the things that I would say. Going back to the point I made earlier about the joyful side of it, I think once you can help anybody crack the code that reading is actually an entertaining thing. Now, I know we don't want to conflate education and entertainment wholly. There's no reason why education can't be something that we learn from. Making some smart choices about what we're introducing as media, what we have on hand. You can't read a book that's not there. And that's not always about growing up as a kid. There wasn't a lot of money for things like that. But I had a really devout family member that would take me to the library. Every 2 weeks, as a rural library, I was allowed to take out 9 books. And every week I took out 9 books, I promise you, poured my way through them. Again, that's not everybody's scenario. Books, I understand I'm old school now. What's reading in a book form anymore? But having some kind of availability, some choices and things that are at hand, it seems really key. And I think if somebody is not, as we were saying before, able to engage maybe at the level that they're supposed to be at, who cares? We care, but in the meantime, find other things that connect at what they're willing to open up and engage with. The other thing I would say, I'm in the realm of poetry, and poetry is got all sorts of reputations for things and stereotypes, but it's actually as we started off talking about the lyric, it's got a deep relationship to musicality. A lot of kids love songs. They actually delight in silliness and songs. And there is a whole world of children's poetry that connects directly to that. And maybe there's entry points that are just hilarious. If you can throw in a fart joke in an important literary text, it's gonna draw some certain kids in, right? Let's face it. And also, is there work that just helps reinforce who they are? And I know this is something that Mar does very well, thinking about who are the actual faces in a picture book? What are the actual foods that people are eating? What is the language that is being expressed? What are the everyday practices? Is it an intergenerational family? Is it a family that goes to a mosque? Is there something happens where, this is a family that cares for little ducks on their farm, or whatever it is? If you've got a lived experience that isn't present in the literature and the words and media around you, look for it, because it probably does exist. And again, the library, long live the library. This is a free source of books. My goodness. And it's huge. So let's go. And the last thing I would say when it comes to kiddos and frankly adults too, interactivity is key. So if you can find work that isn't just a one direction kind of note, but there's a way for people to be involved, and maybe it's reading something and going out and doing something, or maybe it's the kind of workbook where it's there's language and there's pictures, but you get to scribble in it too. These kinds of things. We all want to make our mark, even if it's messy.
Really appreciate all those really tangible and accessible ways that people can engage with literacy. Even what you mentioned about just if someone's really into bugs and going to maybe you said a bug museum or bug zoo and just reading the little signages.
Yeah, you just I don't want to the science center costs money, but there's a lot of nature centers just in parks and things like that.
Yeah,
almost all of the major parks you can walk in and there's a stuffed badger and there's something it's so simple and elegant and accessible and free.
Yeah.
And then there's a didactic. We're going to learn something. And then maybe we're like, oh, I want to learn. Sorry, I cut you off. Did you get to...
No. I was just saying that it kind of just using what works, essentially, like what works, what works. As a kid, I really didn't like reading, and then I got to a point where I read, and then if I could watch the movie after, then I was like, okay, like then I'll do that. Or if like music like was a big way that I connected and was able to engage with literacy, which now looking at it saw that I was engaging with literacy. And so I think those are really, really great ways for young people, especially racialized children, to be able to connect with literacy and make it exciting. So I really appreciate that. I would love to open the space now for questions. So I wanted to say thank you, Cecily. This has been such a great conversation, and it's evident that literacy holds such radical and anti-racist power. And so I hope everyone walks away with a deeper love for words. If anyone had any questions I'd like to ask or thoughts, anything like that.
While you're thinking, one brief thing I was going to say is remember that when we're working with kiddos, that what we do, we model something. So if you're not reading, like maybe it's something that you need to fold in collectively. And also, if when at a loss and people aren't picking up the literary page, we can read too. We can read stories to people. So that's another sort of is practical.
For sure. Thank you.
Chris?
Hello.
Hey.
Thanks so much for your talk. And yeah, it was very inspiring. I took lots of notes that I really relate with. And two things. So, I have a 13-year-old. Kids today seem to be, and I also work with like a lot of teenagers, and like most of them are not wanting to read books. They're not wanting to look at the papers version. But and I'm a singer and songwriter, and I also address like a lot of these issues, and I also like relate to the different content that you're talking about. And I really enjoy reaching people that way. What's your experience, or do you have any experience with like talking about those messages that help visible minority kids to connect with themselves and see themselves, and in ways that are through video? Video seems to be it's the form of media and messages that is, that 95% of the kids are mostly accessing. But what's your experience with that? Like, do you verbalize your poetry? Do you make videos? Do you create accessible media that they're interested in that way as well?
Yeah, I think it's such a critical question that you've asked there, because the fact is, like, the ways in which children increasingly are taking in information is not in print and book form. And that is, and I would say myself, I read probably more from my Kindle these days than I do from actual book objects as well, I should acknowledge. Poetry, so a couple things I would say. One is there is the possibility always of turning on captions for videos. And I know it's often understood as an accessibility formatting thing. And depending on where those captions are coming from, they may be good, they may be bad. But definitely anything on the television is a fairly high level of description and introduces immediately text and writing and reading rather to the video component. That is something that I would encourage trying from time to time. I would also definitely help folks understand that television, media, video work, these are not unwritten things. And I think there's this kind of perception that somehow it's outside of the realm of script. I'm in the School of Creative Writing. A lot of my compatriots, my colleagues, are teaching things like TV writing, film writing. One of our most popular series of courses is around video game writing. That is a craft. That is not a minor. It's one of the largest. It's perhaps the largest media industry in the world. And there's a significant amount of narrative, plot development. Like, there's actual literary work happening in that genre as well. And so I would say pay attention to those other places where literary stuff is cropping up. And also, as I was saying earlier, outside of book form. So when it occurs, maybe it's just a one sheet of information. Maybe it's just, like something that's like a snapshot of something, but we're still engaging that capacity to read. I am quite worried about sort of what is the future where we don't engage reading and writing as an actual skill set. And then the question about my own practice, my poetry, a lot of it has adult sort of leaning tendencies in terms of accessibility. So there's not a lot in my work that would be, more recently, I wrote a book recently about crows, and there's, if somebody's interested in birds and crows, they might be interested in this work. But I can't say that practice for me is looking at a younger audience per se. That said, I feel like I do workshops and work with youth from time to time, and almost all of them have this sense of rhythm and cadence, the aesthetics and form that is possible to create lyric and verse in them. And it's kind of awesome. And partly it's because they're growing up with the influences of, yes, music, but also like spoken word and rap culture. So I would not ever remove hip hop and spoken word and orality as it comes in its many forms culturally from the practice of literacy. I think that's pretty important. And if anything, we're kind of circling back in a moment historically in human history where that is even more so and powerful. Like the capacity to speak well and articulate ourselves and plan things out. This is an important skill. I hope I answered a question there somehow.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. I love that. Yeah. And getting the kids to express themselves in artistic form and helping facilitate that is so important. I love how you touched on that. Thanks.
There was just a question in the chat that I just wanted to read out quickly. With the state of the world, always, but in particular the last several weeks/months, what literacy practices do you engage in to help process or access healing?
Well, I would say, first of all, that I definitely am very particular about how much time I spend on unmediated consumption of the internet. And that's me as an adult with my developed faculties and critical thought. So there is no question to me that, unfiltered access, and I don't think I need to say this to any of you all. If you've got kids, you're thinking about this probably all the time. But yeah, so I think it's just something that has to be kept at a very manageable level, not to sort of move. I mean, I grew up actually not watching television for most of my youth. I was allowed 1 hour of TV a week, which was very unusual for my age group at the time. And so I felt the loss of that, frankly, culturally. But there was probably an upside to it as well. But I think, some limits, obviously, and not just having media as reward, being very deliberate about the choices that one is making about what they're going to watch and how. I don't think it's possible to protect anybody from what the world is in a general sense. I mean, they're going to get there soon enough, but I mean, I do think we obviously have to take a lot of care to help reinforce what is beautiful and grounded and empathetic and generative and kind and truthful. These are real things. Being honest is a real thing, even though our leadership maybe is not, as adept at it as children can be, being kind, using our inside voices. Like these are, I've sometimes, I've been, in city councils and in offices of high regard, and just been appalled at how much like a kindergarten classroom it actually felt like. So I think kids have a lot of capacity for gentleness and connection and care, and nurturing those things and finding the things that nurture them. Relationships to animals is really important to me and has been for a lot of the kids that I connect to. But just like being, maybe an animal isn't possible, but, caring for a plant or following the life cycle of something outside. Like, do you know the story of the apple tree out in the backyard? Or can we plant something and see what happens in the spring? Like just these cyclical, sustained, simple and nurturing things to counter all of that stuff out there. I think this is a time to really strive for connection at the level of community, more than ever.
Thank you. Dana, did you have a hand raised?
I do. Thank you. And thank you so much for this very impactful webinar session. I really like the discussions around the diaspora and acknowledging how literacy really amplifies resiliency, even though it's not intended, because our bodies are apolitic by nature. And that being said, when it comes to accessing literary information regarding social justice, I'm wondering what methods can we use to recognize the author's positionality, especially in a realm today where we have pretendians. Thomas King is a very world-renowned author that's Indigenous, and I felt like that was something that came down in the community as a bit of a betrayal and hurt. So how can we be mindful with the type of media and resources we're consuming?
Such a tender question. Thank you for that. And I don't have a profound answer to it at all. It's really difficult in these kinds of moments. As you reference King, I mean, it's a betrayal, and I just want to take care and support in terms of Indigenous community and nations. Like there's so much brilliant work out there. So when we have these kind of large scale personalities that have taken this chunk of people's attention when there's all this other work happening, very frustrating. So I think it's not unlike many things in life where we have to develop relationships with things. And so we're not just picking a book off the shelf because it looks good and has the right copy or in the book jacket. I mean, again, I don't mean to patronize. I'm sure none of you are doing this, but sometimes we can fall for it because design and representation can be manipulated. So I think like taking time to learn about who it is that we're taking in, especially for children, and doing a little bit of work in reading is one thought. The other thought is that always a plurality of voices. When it comes to the experience of Black orality, I would look in poetry, for example, think of somebody like Cecily Nicholson, okay, but maybe like Claire Harris or Bertrand Bickerson, or, there's other poets in the Canadian landscape and beyond. There's always more than one voice, and it's not that each voice isn't special in its own compounded. That's when we're connecting with, Black diaspora experience in Canada. We can't just read a handful of people. So if we're really committed to it, I would say that we have to build a collection. We have to build that in a plural way. So those are a couple of thoughts that I have. And then I also, look to other educators, people that are of those experiences, potentially if they're not your own, and hear and see what other people are engaging in reading. Take recommendations. A community network like you all have going here is brilliant, because I read this book, I met this author, they did the super grounded kind of presentation in a classroom. Everybody check out this, share that stuff, because that's what I'm talking about, community. I mean, that's part of what we get to do at that level, is build our resources, our information.
There are so many great questions and comments going around. I just wanted to check if there are any more. I didn't want to keep you too long, but there's some really lovely comments. If you wanted to take a look, I'm just checking if there's any more.
Thanks for all your lovely comments, everyone. Of course, my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the work that you do.
There's one question from Amira. Do you have any recommendations of works of literacy, particularly amplifying the voices of marginalized people and communities?
Kind of all I read, so I don't even know where to start. Okay, here's a couple of notes, and just thinking about the youth-based practices. If you haven't had a chance to engage Robin Kimmerer's reboot of Braiding Sweetgrass, because she returned to that text and developed kind of an interactive education sort of focused youth kind of element. I think that's a really wonderful example of some of the things that I'm touching on today. Beautiful work. I had already shouted out Jordan Scott's work, because there's just so many beautiful children's writers in BC, like in this neck of the woods, straight up. Like, we've got something going on here. But yeah, I feel like I don't even know where I would start and stop with that, because that's the majority of what I read are racialized community members. I read a ton of poetry, and out of necessity and love and relations. I actually read mostly science fiction. What I fall asleep to every night with my Kindle teddy bear is typically an active novel in the realm of sci-fi. So if you are into that genre, which is a wonderful and imaginative field, there's no end to racialized writers. But I mean, the classic, of course, is Octavia Butler, but like thinking of like M.K. Jemisin and Nnedi Okorafor. I don't know. It's just there's a long list of, especially of powerful Black and femme experiences in that field. But yeah, I think, again, go to your networks. There's lots of wonderful lists online. There's just different sort of resources that can help alert you to the interest of who it is that you're trying to gather resources for, because so many books out there.
And then Jed said, are you part of the MAR online community already? We have ways to connect with each other on that platform.
Oh, beautiful. I am not a mom, so I mean, I'm adjacent and available, but it's probably not the right fit maybe for me, but yeah.
I think anyone in mothering roles, aunties, teachers.
Okay.
Yeah. Mom adjacents are welcome. And yes, Chris, if you join the MAR app, we have a really lovely space for everyone to chat and connect. Thank you for that wonderful conversation, Cecily, and thank you everyone for all those great questions. And thank you, Cecilia, for putting some of the works that Cecily was mentioning in the comments. So if anyone's interested, they are there. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining today.
Thank you, Reagan.